Thank you for coming, giving up your evening. Is this on? Can you hear me? Sort of, yeah. Thanks for coming and giving up your evening. And once again, as all week, we're going to be looking at this document in front of you, which is a first century eyewitness, well, not written by an eyewitness, but written by somebody who was best friend of an eyewitness to Jesus. First century text translated into English. And I'm hoping this week that we will engage with Jesus as he actually is and was. Things he really said, things he really did. Get close and personal with the historical sources. And so each day we've been looking at just a little different page of this book, different episode in Jesus' life. And I think consistently he has surprised us because Jesus isn't the same as the fairy story version of him, or the stained glass window version of him. He's more edgy, he's more uncomfortable, he's more frightening, he's more real, he's more historical. This is a Jesus who really lived, and what the people who knew him really saw him do. And I hope that it will be much harder to dismiss than you might have thought in the beginning of the week. Now, lots of this book is about Jesus. It's a biography of Jesus, things he did and said, but it's actually also about us. And that's what I want to focus on this evening. It's not just a book about what Jesus did, but it's a book about how people responded to him. And it might be that you've been along a little bit this week and you've begun to engage with it. And I want us to look at what Jesus says about the people who engage with him and some of the dangers that we can fall into. And the first thing I want to say is that as people get to know Jesus better, it isn't necessarily the case that they become more and more informed by the evidence and follow where the evidence leads. It is possible to take the other approach, that the more you find out about Jesus, the more you resist the evidence. And as you learn more and more, you become more and more entrenched in opposition. And I hope to show you that as we go through a few episodes in chapter 2. So it's on page 8 of the book, and we're going to go through quite a bit more text than we have previously tonight. We have a bit more time to do that. And I want you to watch the progression. So we begin in a place called Capernaum at the beginning of chapter 2, page 8. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he'd come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. Since they couldn't get to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. So you've got to understand that these are not concrete buildings, they're just made with a tile roof. So it's not impossible to dig a hole in the ceiling. It's just extremely rude. But these people are very, very keen that their paralyzed friend gets to see Jesus, so they dig a hole in the roof and they lower him down immediately in the middle of them. Can you imagine that scene? There you are in the house, it's crowded, people listening to Jesus teaching. Suddenly there's a scratching sound, and then masonry starts to fall down, a bit of dust, and you look up, and then a little hole appears, and then a foot, and then a leg, and then a guy lowered down in front of them. It must be an amazing scene. And Jesus, when he sees it, says to the paralyzed man, immediately, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Which is an amazing thing to say, but also quite a scandalous thing to say. Jesus never met this guy before, I presume. And then Jesus proposes to wipe his slate clean of everything he's ever done wrong, just with a word. It's an amazing thing to do, isn't it? But what an arrogant, what an outrageous thing to claim to be able to do. I mean, imagine there's somebody that you've had all sorts of difficult relationships with. I think of my sister growing up, we always used to fight. And imagine after one particularly bad row, we meet a stranger in the street and he says, "Oh, Andrew, just by the way, about this thing with your sister, you're forgiven." I mean, who even are you? Surely that's my sister's prerogative. Or maybe there's some relationship at university that's broken down badly. Maybe someone you were dating and it ended in a very bad way, and there's all sorts of bad blood between you. And then Jesus comes along and says to your girlfriend, "Oh, you're forgiven." What? I mean, who do you think you are, Jesus? That's my prerogative to forgive them. And so people start to question this. Verse 6, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? It's a fair question, isn't it? I mean, who does Jesus think he is, wading into other people's disagreements and pronouncing people are forgiven? It's a kind of shocking thing to do. Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? What do you think? What is easier? Is it easier to say to a quadriplegic, you're forgiven, or is it easier to say, you're healed, get up and walk? Well, it's pretty obvious that saying you're forgiven is something anyone can do. Any religious charlatan can say that. I'll try it now. I'm a Church of England vicar. Say, Oliver, you're forgiven. I forgive you. I forgive you. I mean, anyone can say that. But how does he know that anything's any different, right? I'm just a religious bloke on my own authority going, I forgive you. Right? I mean, it's easy to say. Whereas, if you took me down to the Bristol Infirmary and we went into the orthopaedic ward and there's someone who's broken their leg and it's in traction, and I say, get up, it's going to be more obvious I'm a fake, isn't it? I can just say, oh no, you're forgiven, but you just can't tell because it's all inside you in a spiritual kind of way. But you can tell if you can walk, right? It's pretty obvious. So what Jesus is saying is, forgiveness is an invisible thing to do, but healing people who are quadriplegic, it'll be pretty obvious. So he says to the man, so that you know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. He got up, took his mat and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. We keep seeing this in Mark's Gospel, that Jesus doesn't just make a claim, he also proves the claim. There's real evidence in front of eyewitnesses that we ought to take this seriously. Now, at this point, I think we should be quite amazed, right? So the claim to be able to forgive you is one thing, but the claim backed up by an extraordinary miracle. Here is a quadriplegic man now walking down the street. That ought to be a very wonderful thing. People ought to start following Jesus now. Start asking for him for his forgiveness, if they really saw this. But that isn't what happens. Just look down. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many of them who followed him. We said earlier in the week, tax collectors in those days were despised because they were Jewish people collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman occupying power, taxing their own people and paying the enemy. People hated them. But they were friends with Jesus. One of his followers was a tax collector. Verse 16, when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Again, it's not an unreasonable question, I think. It's not an unreasonable question. So imagine, you knew somebody was a church leader in Bristol, and you also saw them every Friday night hanging out in the red light district. I don't know if there is one in Bristol, but let's say in London, you see them hanging around in the red light district in London, and you start to ask questions. It's not unreasonable, is it? If you're so righteous and religious and spiritual, why are you hanging out with people like this? I've got some questions for you to answer. So they asked Jesus, what are you doing with this kind of company? And Jesus explains, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners. See, my whole mission is about going to people who've really blown it, who don't make it to God's standards at all. And I've come to bring them spiritual medicine, to bring them forgiveness. Wow. It's a bit like if this local church leader were to say, it's because I also work for the NHS as an HIV worker. So that's why I'm often to be found amongst the sex workers at weekends. Oh, wow, well, good on you. See, so there's a skepticism at first, and it's sort of justified. I mean, who is this guy forgiving people? Who is this guy hanging out with those sorts of people? But then Jesus demonstrates and explains, and we ought to say, oh, fair enough. So I misunderstood, and I was slow to be sure, but you're right, Jesus, you've just done an amazing miracle, and you're doing this amazing ministry of forgiving people, and great. But they don't react like that. Episode 3, page 10. Now, John's disciples, that's a guy called John the Baptist, who was a famous preacher at the time. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. They were abstaining from food in order to pray a bit more. Some people came and asked Jesus, how come John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot as long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Jesus says, you can't fast at a wedding. This is a time of celebration. And he's implying in this analogy that he is the bridegroom. It was a picture of God in the Jewish scriptures coming to be in a relationship with his people. As if God were to marry you, as if you were to be in the most intimate possible relationship. And Jesus says, that's not a time for fasting. That's a time for feasting. It's a time for nachos. So you see the pattern. What's happening is Jesus does something that doesn't quite fit people's expectations. They raise questions about it, and Jesus gives them an answer, and it's a very good answer. How can you forgive people? I'll prove you I can forgive people. I'll heal a quadriplegic. How come you're hanging out with them? Because I'm a sin doctor. I come to help people who are morally in a mess. How come you're not fasting? Because this is the day of celebration. God has come to be with his people in a relationship with them. Now, you'd expect then, wouldn't you, that the more evidence you see, the more you'll be drawn to Jesus. That would certainly be the logical and rational thing to do. Maybe that's been happening to you this week. On Monday, you knew nothing about Jesus at all, and you started to discover there is real historical evidence for him. There's things he does before eyewitnesses that only someone from God could do. Healing people from paralysis, opening blind man's eyes, walking on water, feeding 5,000 people with a few bread. If that really happened, it's got to be someone important. He must be from God. And you've begun to hear more and more of Jesus' explanation about his mission. He's come to fix a problem that we can't fix. A problem of the evil inside us, the things we've done wrong, the forgiveness we desperately need. He's come to offer it. And it ought to be that the more evidence you get about Jesus, the more you're drawn to him. But I wonder if you notice so far that is not the trend. He's blaspheming, and then he heals somebody. Why are you eating with people like that? Then he explains. How come you're not fasting? Then he explains. How come you're breaking the Sabbath? The next episode. And he explains. And even though Jesus continues to give a fuller and fuller account of him, people aren't getting closer and closer to him. And the reason is they've decided they don't want to follow him. The evidence is getting stronger. The explanations are getting fuller, but they just don't want to. And so they find smaller and smaller and more absurd reasons to object. And the worst one of all is over the page in chapter 3. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Isn't that interesting? They've already made their mind up. They're not on his side, and they're just looking for excuses to nail him. They're looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, and they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. It's a Jewish law about not working on Saturdays, and they thought, let's see if Jesus works on a Saturday, because if he does, we'll get him on that. That'll be the thing to trap him on that. It's bizarre logic, isn't it? Because presumably if Jesus can heal on a Saturday, that means he can heal, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. If there's a man with a withered hand and Jesus can sort it out on a Saturday, surely that you'd think that the big thing would be, wow, he did a miracle, that man's hand's okay. And they're saying, let's see if he does it on a Saturday. So on a Saturday, we've got him. It's sort of perverse, isn't it? They're not coming in an open-minded way. They're coming in there, anything I can find to be an excuse not to have to take him seriously kind of way. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." And Jesus asked them, "What is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" It's kind of obvious answer, isn't it? Jesus, to do something wonderful on the Sabbath, like heal a man who can't use his hand, it's withered away. That would be a beautiful thing to do on the Sabbath. They remained silent. They can't answer. So he looked round at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees said, "Oh, well, that's the final bit of evidence we needed, because he must be from God. He can heal like this. We want to now follow him and put our trust in him." No, that isn't what it says. John, look down. It's not what it says at all. Verse 6, "Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." It is perverse, actually. It's not the logical conclusion to the evidence. And Mark is warning us early on in his account, don't think that everybody interacts with Jesus objectively. In fact, don't think that you engage with the evidence objectively. We've all got vested interests. And it just might be that what's really going on is that despite the evidence, despite the explanations, you just don't want to follow him. You don't want him to be God's king in your life. And so you will find smaller and more silly reasons to object and to reject him. And that's the trajectory, we're told, that led to Jesus' execution. Let's kill him. Beware, can I say, of your own heart. It sounds rude of me to say that to you, but I can say it autobiographically. When I was looking into Christianity, I think I said this earlier today, I became more and more convinced it was true, and more scared that it might be true. And I didn't want it to be true. And so I found silly reasons to avoid it, to reject it. And I want to warn you that if you're on that trajectory, it ends with complete rejection, with blindness, you're so entrenched that no amount of evidence will ever get you out of it. So beware if you're going that way. First thing, beware that you don't get stuck in rejection. Second point, this is the last thing I'm going to say today. Second point, make sure you keep listening, therefore. So I'll just summarize what happens next. So the religious authorities decisively reject Jesus. Jesus says that's okay. He then appoints 12, all sorts of different people, fishermen, tax collectors, a sort of ramshackle bunch of rejects from society, and he appoints them to be his apostles. And significantly, there are 12 of them. That's key because Israel had 12 tribes, the 12 families of ancient nation of Israel. And the 12 tribes were sort of the power structure of the country. And Jesus says, if you're going to reject me, that's okay. I can find 12 other people to be in charge. And he just finds nobodies, fishermen, tax collectors, and makes them in charge of his new kingdom. And we're told that those who are following him are listening to him on the inside, and those who are rejecting him are outside. And I want you to turn to chapter 4 on page... Oh, hang on. So let's just turn to chapter 3, verse 31. So page 14. Page 14, 331. Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone to call Jesus in. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he said. He looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." So you got this insiders and these outsiders. The outsiders are those who aren't listening, even though they're of his own family. The insiders are those who've gathered close to hear what he says. And what he says is over the page. And then this is our last thing for this evening. Page 16. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered round him was so large that he got into a boat and sat out on the lake while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." Jesus says, "Whoever had ears to hear, let them hear." When he was alone, the 12, that's his followers, the 12 and the others around him asked about the parables, but he said, "The secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, those who won't listen, those who are rejecting me, everything is in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding, otherwise they might turn and be forgiven." See, Jesus is saying there's a kind of filtering process going on. If you listen to him, if you're on the inside, if you come and draw near, he's going to give you the secret of the kingdom. But if you won't listen to him, if despite the evidence, if the more you find out, but you just keep him at arm's length, he says you're going to be left on the outside. And if you're on the outside, I'm going to make it very, very difficult for you to understand. There's a kind of filtering process going on. Not everybody can understand Jesus. Only the people who will come near to listen. And those who begin to stick their fingers in their ears and resist and harden their hearts and become entrenched in their rejection. Jesus says, no, you'll never understand. You'll be blinded and deafened. Jesus said, verse 13, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word." Jesus' little story is about a man going out to sow seed. He's actually going out to sow this message that we've been teaching all week. Now, I was actually quite tempted to go to Waitrose this afternoon and buy some sunflower seeds and throw them at you now. I decided not to because we've done quite a lot of hoovering, mainly because of the cheese and the cheese sandwiches at lunchtime gets quite stuck in the carpet. And I thought the last thing I want to do late on the Thursday night of events week is to hoover up sunflower seeds. But just imagine it. As I'm speaking to you, according to Jesus' little story, it's like a farmer sowing seed. I'm giving words, and imagine it, right, in your mind's eye, instead of actually having to hoover it up. See, there we are. Sunflower seeds all hitting you in the face. It's going everywhere. There we are. That's it. It's almost as good, isn't it, if you imagine it, as if I did it? I think so. There we are. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes the word away that was sown in them. I've had this experience. It's like you go into church, you hear something that strikes you, and you think, wow, that could be important. But by the time you've walked out the door, you're already thinking about Brexit, or about your football team, or about your economics exam, or about whatever it is. But it's just gone. There was a moment while you were in Woodlands Church at lunchtime where you thought this could be important, but then it's just like that. It's gone. Seed along the path. Others, like seeds sown in rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So this is someone who hears the message of Jesus and says, this is fantastic. This is the best thing I've ever heard. Forgiveness for my sins, a hope of life in a new world forever. Yeah, I'm in. Count me in. And they're really excited about it. And then they start to tell their course mates, I've become a Christian. I started to follow Jesus. And their course mates aren't as pleased about it as they thought they'd be. And there starts to be opposition. And your boyfriend or your girlfriend doesn't like it and says she's going to break up with you. He's going to break up with you. And it starts to be quite costly. You say, this wasn't what I signed up for. I thought it was going to make my life better. It's making my life worse. And because there's no real foundation, then it just withers. It's just gone. Quickly full of. I can think of people like this. At our church in Greenwich, we get quite a lot of students, but like here. And in Freshers Week, we had quite a lot of people join us. I'm really keen. I want to follow Jesus at university. And by Christmas, half of them are gone. It's just too difficult. And they wither. Still others, like seed sown among the thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Anxieties, exams, career, the deceitfulness of wealth. If only I can get that job and get that money, that will make my life secure. It's deceitful. It actually won't make your life secure. You can get cancer just as easily as a rich person as a poor person. But it deceives you into thinking it will make you secure. And the desires for other things. I really want that girl. I really want that boy. Choke the word. See, in competition with living for Jesus. And it becomes unfruitful. So in other words, this farmer, he's not having a good day, is he? Throwing out the seed. Some of it immediately is lost by the birds of the air come and eat it. Some of it springs up, but then the sun scorches it, doesn't last. Others of it grows up, but then the weeds and the thorns choke it. The scary thing is, that is Jesus' description of this week. I don't know if you realise that. We've been throwing out the seeds. Some people, by the time they've left the building, have forgotten everything that was said. Others, there might be a momentary bit of enthusiasm, but as soon as they begin to consider the cost of following Jesus, it will be withered. Other people make a start in following Jesus. That's the most discouraging of all. You think, yes, this person's coming to follow Jesus, but then along come the other things, the deceitfulness of wealth, the desire for other things, and it's choked and it goes nowhere. That's you. Maybe you're the path. You'll have forgotten what I've said by the time you've left the building. Or by the end of next week when revision kicks in or whatever it is. Brexit happens or doesn't happen. You'll have forgotten that weird week. Oh yeah, I do remember actually. There was that week at uni when I went to that Woodlands church and someone says, I can't remember about that now. Just be gone. That could be you. Or the enthusiasm, this is a wonderful thing, I think I want it, but then the struggle, I know it's not really worth it, and I don't think I will go that way after all. That could be you. Or the beginnings of a Christian life, and then along come other things, and so the word doesn't really get such a look in, and that could be you. But then the good news at the end. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. Jesus' message not about himself, we've been looking at that most of the week, but Jesus' message about us as we hear him. And 2 points for this evening to consider. Firstly, just beware, there's no such thing as neutrality. As we hear more and more of Jesus, we're either drawn by the evidence, by his teaching, by our understanding, we get closer and closer, or we're so desperate not to be drawn that we become entrenched and we find sillier and sillier reasons to object and become more and more hardened to the evidence. That's the danger. And so Jesus' suggestion is make sure you listen and keep listening. Make sure the word that was shared this week isn't immediately snatched out of your mind so that you don't think about it again. Make sure you're realistic about the cost of following Jesus, the opposition that will come so it doesn't catch you by surprise. Make sure that you really are deciding that Jesus comes first before those other things, the wealth and the relationships and persevere and keep listening. It might be you think that's nonsense. But if this touches a nerve, can I invite you to decide today how you will continue to listen? think that's the best sort of action that you can actually take. It might be that you're not ready to follow Jesus. There's lots more that you need to ask. That's fair enough. You need to do more investigating. Please do. But just decide now how you will listen next week. I mean, listening this week is easy, isn't it? Because you can't move around campus without a Christian throwing a flyer into your face saying, come at lunchtime. It's easy this week, but next week there'll be, don't worry, the density of Christians with annoying flyers will decrease in Bristol. And it'll be easier to forget it. So decide not to. So it might be you decide this Christianity Explored thing on Monday nights. That could be a good way of listening, because it's once a week. It will at least keep it on the agenda once a week for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Maybe do that. Or maybe resolve to read this with a Christian friend. I was suggesting 1 chapter, 1 coffee. So 16 chapters, 16 coffees. The Christian's going to buy the coffee. I'm promising that on their behalf. But why not say, I'll do that for chapter 1. I'll read chapter 1 and I'll do the coffee. And then if that's useful, then do chapter 2. Do it until you're convinced that Jesus is a fraud and that you can safely dismiss the whole thing as a fairy tale. Or do it until you're sure that Jesus is worth following. But don't do the default thing where it just disappears off the agenda, just gets snatched away. So easy for that to happen. Keep listening. It might be that you've just realised about yourself that you've begun to dig your heels in. You're finding more and more excuses to avoid Jesus. Be honest about what's happening and be careful. You don't want to get stuck like that in opposition. Or it might be that you can see the weeds in your life, the ways that other things are coming in. Maybe once you were enthusiastic about Jesus, and yet now you're more enthusiastic about a relationship or about a degree or about something else in life that promises so much but is actually deceiving you. Well, pull up the weeds. Take action. Jesus says, whoever has an ear, let him hear. Listen. Keep listening.